Hey, and welcome to the Soulfire Inspiration Podcast. My name is Webby, and I'm glad you're listening in. I do this to encourage you so that you're inspired to live intentionally and purposefully. I hope you're keeping safe and doing everything that you can to protect yourself and your loved ones. Before I go into today's reflection, allow me to just remind us that given the time that we're living in, we can't ever let our guards down in terms of or in regards to exercising caution. So if you're walking up and down, if you're out and about, please remember to wear your mask and to wear it correctly. Remember to wash your hands with water and soap, and in the absence of that, remember to use sanitizers. Also very important is that you need to practice and maintain the practice of social distancing. You'd rather not expose yourself or be nonchalant, imagining that you can't be infected, when the reality is that right now, and especially if you live in Kenya, infection is at an all-time high. Wherever it is you're around the world, wherever it is that you are around the world, please remember that you have to continue to practice caution, because whilst the authorities are doing the best they can to help flatten the curve, they're not going to succeed without us playing our part. So please remember, you've got to protect yourself. You've got to protect your loved ones. You've got to continue to maintain caution at all times, because prevention is always better than cure. With that said, let's jump right in. We've been talking about things to leave behind in a new season, and today's reflection is about the old excuses. So that's like one part of the reflection. The overarching topic has been about things to leave behind in a new season, and today our reflection focus is the old excuses. In the first part, I talked about leaving behind the old mindset. In the second part was about leaving behind the old pattern, and now it's the old excuses. And just like the things that I've mentioned before, this is one of those that has to stay in the rear view. Excuses may stem from feeling inadequate in regards to new challenges, or even from the fear of failure. They may also be a sign of another underlying problem, i.e., laziness. Part of the human experience is that whenever we're faced with something that we feel a bit unsure about, we may tend to make excuses, to deflect, to stall, to delay, if you like. And I think I found myself in that space. I mean, if I'm being really honest, even starting this podcast for me, whilst this conversation started a couple of years ago, there are instances where I could have started but made excuses because I felt like I didn't have enough. I didn't know what to talk about. I wasn't sure that I would be any good at it, or that anything I would say would have any value to anyone listening. But you see, there was always going to be only one way to find out, and that would be to take the step and find out, to take the step towards it, or to take the step and start, and then see where that leads. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're faced with a challenge, or you're being called out of your comfort zone, and you find yourself making an excuse or making excuses to not go into that because you kind of want to hold on to what is familiar. You want to stay in a place because you kind of know the ins and the outs and the parameters within which you can operate, and so it's kind of a comfortable space that you don't want to get out of. Then that might be a good time to begin introspecting to see why exactly it is that you're making those excuses. I mean, of course, everybody would like to remain in a place that's familiar, because then they know the ins and outs, like I said. And if you know the parameters within which you can work, you can kind of predict what's going to come, because this is kind of a pattern that you can work with. But the moment that you're faced with having to step out of a comfort zone and you're going to be kind of like a fish out of water, the first thought is that this might actually not work, or this might, send me into a place of disadvantage, and that's not something that I really want. But yet, even with that, there's always a flip side perspective. This is kind of like two sides of a coin. Whilst it is true, the fear is real, and you're a bit apprehensive about this, not whatever the challenge is, it not working out the way you imagine or the way you would hope it would, or that it should. There's also the perspective that it may turn out to be so much better than you imagined, Life is consistently moving in the direction of forward. If forward was a street, life's definitely on there. And every experience, every hour that's gone, every minute, everything that's already happened has happened. You can't get that back. All you can do is you can learn from the lessons that every experience has left you with, and hopefully do better in the next round of whatever that experience was about. And I think that, like I've said before, perhaps in a different episode, and if you go back to the previous episodes of this series, you might catch that I said that, even if life tends to be a forward-moving thing, there's never going to be a time where you master knowing what's going to come. The only thing you can master is how you respond. More importantly, how you master or how you manage through the transitions of the seasons of life. You're always getting out of something and getting into something else, If you're getting out of a season of rest, then you're probably getting into a season of, let me call that hard work, or of planting, or of building, or of setting something up, preparing for your new environment, setting up the parameters within which you'll operate. If you're coming out of a season of loss, the hope and the prayer, of course, is that you're getting into a season of winning. And usually that's an easier season to prepare for because it's something you absolutely want. But what about if you're faced with a situation that you would otherwise describe as uncertain or unideal? Then what do you do? Well, you can never really have all the facts. You can never really have all the information at hand. But what you do have is the opportunity to choose to position yourself to get the most out of whatever's coming next. And one of the ways to do that is to not take the excuses or the thought processes, like we've mentioned in the previous episodes, not to take those with you into the next season of your life, because they're not going to do you any good. All they're going to be is limiting factors. Excuses, like in today's reflection, are going to limit you from taking hold with both hands of everything that you're going to find in the new season of your life. So, for example, if, let's say, you've done really well in the last season of your life in an assignment or in a place where you were working, or in a space that you were given responsibility, and now in a new season of your life, those responsibilities have increased. Of course, it's completely normal to feel inadequate. And it's completely normal to not want to have to take on those responsibilities, especially if those were responsibilities you didn't necessarily ask for or you wouldn't have chosen. But many times let me put it this way, that's life's way of showing you that there's more in you than even you're aware of. And that's a really good perspective to take with you, that there's always going to be more in you than you're aware of. And life just has a way of positioning you to tap deep into yourself and bring that out for the benefit of yourself and consequently for the benefit of others. Many times you might find yourself, and I've found myself in this space, making excuses because I'm trying to have all the information beforehand. I'm trying to have all the resources beforehand. And it's not always like that. Most of my life experiences have been, just take the first step and then see what happens next. And, in the process of just thinking about how I've managed through some of those, and perhaps you should do the same as well. I came across a scripture that was of great encouragement to me, and that is out of Proverbs chapter 20, verse 24, and it says this: "The Lord directs our steps, so why try to understand everything along the way?" And what I got out of that is God wrote and has already prepared the story of our lives. Everything that's going to happen from the time we got into this earth to the time we get out, or rather to the time we leave this earth, everything is an open book to Him. And my thought is, if He's directing the steps, if He's directing my paths, if He's directing everything that's happening because He has a will, He has a plan, He has a purpose, then that means I'm already at an advantage right off the bat, because He's always going to work things out in such a way that it's for good. Whether it's for my good, well, it's definitely for my good, but I wouldn't know the extent of that good until I begin to take the steps of faith along that path that has already been prepared for me in advance. and not taking those steps, or not allowing myself, or not choosing to be on that path, would be simply robbing myself of everything that has already been prepared for me. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, it always comes down to this. What would you rather? Stab around in the dark trying to figure out what might be, or follow a path that has already been predestined and has already been provided for? Everything that God brings us into and everything that God leads us through, He's already provided for, whether that's grace, whether that's financial support, whether that's people support, or can I say human resource. It doesn't promise that the experiences will always be roses are red and violets are blue, but even the difficult experiences will always leave you with something that would add value. So if your fear, for instance, is the fear of failure, you're afraid of failing, or you're afraid of pain, or you're afraid of having to go through an unideal experience, then perhaps maybe I keep saying perhaps maybe, and that's very funny, but perhaps what you need to do is have a little perspective tweak, begin to embrace even circumstances you would otherwise describe as unideal as learning experiences, because even if that learning experience will have you go back to the drawing board and start all over, the beauty is you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from a place of experience, and that will always give you some kind of head start. You'll make better decisions, and whatever it was that you were afraid of, that you thought in your mind might happen or might throw you completely off course, now you've kind of had the experience of how things are starting to fall in place, and so maybe it doesn't look as daunting anymore. Starting over may not always be such a bad thing if that's what you have to do, because in this moment you're starting with some things. It's like you have some tips and tricks. You kind of have a bit of a cheat sheet. And that's not a bad thing, when you think about it. Yeah. So be encouraged. In case you find yourself struggling to grab your bull by the horns, whatever it is you're afraid of, there's a flip side perspective of that, to that. And you're always going to be pleasantly surprised by the things you choose to take on than the things you don't, because then you'll never know. Well, I do hope that this has been encouraging to you. And I'd actually love to hear your thoughts and comments about this. Of course, this is a really broad conversation, and so there are very many moving parts. And of course, we're not going to be able to cover everything in this one episode. But what are some of your thoughts about this? What are some of your experiences? I'd love to hear from you. And for me to be able to do that, then I'd ask you to please send me a message. There's the option to send a voice message to me wherever it is that you're listening to this podcast on. But if you would rather not put your voice on there and you'd rather just write, then you could always email me on podcast@soulfireinspiration.com. I look forward to catching you on the next one. Till then, remember, be safe and be loved.